Hello and welcome to the CX Files for April 2nd, 2026. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal. And Mark, great to catch up. It is going to be a very interesting chat that we have today with a bit of a superstar.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that you're talking about customer rage, so it should be a good one.
Yeah, we are talking about customer rage, and customer rage is something that I don't think that anybody should underestimate. This has been a phenomenon that a lot of individuals would say it was a post-pandemic thing. This was starting to show its ugly head probably a long time before. Many would hypothesize that social media was sort of the catalyst to people getting angry and demonstrating their levels of anger or rage in a public forum. But I was really lucky to catch up with our friend Steve Sullivan, who's not been on the pod before. Now, Steve is with Channel Doctors in the UK, and he'd done a really interesting post a few months ago about this topic. And I thought, from the perspective of individuals that are running contact center operations, or perhaps that are part of frontline teams in person, whether it's in retail, hospitality, travel and tourism, etc. It would be interesting from their perspective to dive into this topic a little bit more and get some granular sense about what's going on. Look, the reality is that individuals are more likely not just to complain than ever before or to attrit and find a different supplier than ever before, but actually to get obnoxious. And we've all seen it. We've all borne witness to this, and it's not pleasant when it takes place.
Yeah, and I think that we've all seen this rise of the social media rage and complaints, where people will say things when it's anonymous and online that they would never say to a person's face. And this has made a lot of social media environments like X just completely toxic now. You can't express any form of opinion without 1,000 people jumping on you and telling you what an idiot you are. In much harsher terms anyway. And I think that this is why so many people are now sort of giving up on a lot of this kind of social media. But what you're seeing is a transference. So where it's an anonymous contact center agent that the person doesn't know, they're now sort of feeling that they can just abuse that person because they don't care about that person at all. So we're seeing this sort of change in behavior, and even to the extent sometimes of in-person encounters where you see retail staff having to wear body cams these days because they're getting abused in shops so often. It's now a sort of fundamental part of the training for customer service agents is how do you deal with anger?
How do you deal with anger? What do you do to address people that are getting obnoxious and unacceptably rude? And something that I think is very disturbing is that people think that this behavior is justified, that they don't mind actually acting in this fashion. It's not acceptable. Customers have a right to get upset if they don't think that they're being serviced in a manner that's efficient or polite. But what they don't have the right to do is be abusive, to throw themselves into rages, and to just behave in an unacceptable fashion. And hopefully, with the discussion I have with Steve today, it's going to shed a little bit of light on why this is happening, and equally importantly, what organizations can do to try and mitigate it, and to try and make sure that if these circumstances do take place, how to diffuse them as quickly as possible. So let's find out what Steve has to say. Well, this week, the CX Files is really excited to go back to our spiritual home to the UK and to catch up with a longtime friend of the podcast, but I will say a first-time guest, Mr. Steve Sullivan, who is the head of Channel Doctors. Steve, great to finally be able to make this timing work. We've been talking about this for several months now, and well, I think the topic is just as relevant, if not more relevant. It's great that we were able to align calendars.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's taken a while, but it's finally good to get here, Peter. And yeah, it's a strange topic, possibly a topic that we accidentally stumbled across, I think, wasn't it?
Well, No, it wasn't because you had done a fantastic LinkedIn post, and I'm starting to think that a lot of topics for the CX file interviews come from LinkedIn because people have some very provocative stuff out there. And you had put something out last year that I thought was phenomenal and a topic that we really haven't gotten into yet. And we'll introduce it in a second. But before we do, Steve, can you just tell us a little bit about channel doctors and yourself and a little bit about how you fit in this broad CX space?
Sure, yeah. So Talent Doctors is a bijou consultancy based in the UK, as you know. I've been running for the last 15 years or so. And my background is very much contact center in that wider CX conversation. Yeah, I guess the whole realm of customer engagement, customer experience, and customer service, and the bringing together of people, process, and technology. It's a changing world, but those three things remain the same, I think, and bringing those together in the interest of brands and customers, that's what gets me up in the morning. So, yeah, that's me.
Our topic today, Steve, is to chat a little bit about, I think, a very important issue and quite frankly, a growing one that based on all the customer service indices we see from around the world, that's customer anger or customer rage. And I don't think this is something that people should undermine or poo-poo, if I can use that expression. This is a real thing. And it
Mm,
doesn't matter where you go. It just seems that consumers are angrier than ever. And they're not just angrier, they're not just sharing it between themselves, but they're sharing their frustration at the point of service. So going back to your post that we discussed on LinkedIn, can you
mm.
talk to us a little bit about how this trend has evolved and why we're at where we're at today?
Yeah, sure. And I suppose the glib answer is it was always a problem. It got much worse for reasons maybe I don't think any of us quite understand through COVID. And like a lot of things that happened through COVID, it doesn't seem to have got any better. And again, a customer experience, as we always say, is very broad, and there's lots of societal issues that might lie behind, and psychological issues that might lie behind. Right, people are becoming more irascible, more easily frustrated, and more willing to express that frustration. And I think certainly in the contact center world, you're right. Um, the common sense view, which would be, I know it's not your fault, customer service agent or advisor, but I need to express my frustration and you are the conduit through which I express it, has now shifted to, I need somebody to blame. And we, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's a lot of blame, there's a lot of recrimination, there's a lot of anger. And I think that is also in the world of commercial interactions and interactions between individuals and organizations. Um, and what lies behind it, I think some of it is because, for understandable reasons and for technology driven reasons, we're pushing people towards self service. And don't get me wrong, 9 times out of 10, most consumers are very happy to self serve. But that means when you can't self serve, you're going to get frustrated. And by the time you've got through to a contact center, most people have already tried to resolve the problem themselves. So there are some justifiable reasons, I think, why the emotional heat might be increasing.
I want to touch on that self-service topic in a little bit, but before we do, broadly speaking, Steve, what do you think businesses are doing that that's promoting this level of frustration amongst customers? And it doesn't even have to be in the call center. It could even be live inside a business, a store, a restaurant, a hotel. And
Mm.
what are they doing that's brought this on? And what do you think they can do to start taking the tone down a little bit? Because I mean, I don't know about you. I've seen people freak out in different businesses before. It's not pleasant. It's actually
Mm.
quite scary. I also heard stories, and I'll just share this anecdotally. When travel came back in a big way post COVID, I remember hearing stories at the Montreal airport. Montreal's where I live, that there was so much anger amongst the people trying to check in for flights or who had disruptions and needed to switch flights, that the abuse that the ticketing agents were getting was forcing some of them to literally walk off the job right then and there in their uniforms and just like
Mm.
leave the ticketing booth. I, it worries me tremendously, and I do think businesses, while they're not always to blame, a lot of times they are to blame. So, how does this dynamic play out in your view?
Well, I think firstly, I think you're absolutely right to call out that we're talking about a degree of mediation. So we're in our world, typically the contact center world is not face to face. But you're absolutely right. In the world of face to face service, everybody has anecdotal stories, and there is evidence, there is statistical, research to back up the fact that people are behaving worse in a face to face environment. And I remember talking not soon after COVID in a charity contact center to somebody who was a veterinary nurse and was obviously passionate about animals. And I did find myself saying, so what are you doing working here? And she said, I couldn't work in a veterinary practice any longer. She said, because of the way our customers would behave towards us. And I was just thrown. You'd think in that environment where people have presumably a much loved, unwell pet, they'd be they would behave themselves. And she said, it became utterly, she couldn't continue to do the job she loved. And that's true of a lot of people in customer facing roles. And I think, again, customer facing roles, particularly look at retail and hospitality, are, I think, universally some of the least well paid roles. They tend to be typified by casual contracts and maybe a lack of commitment from the employer. So I think in terms of the responsibility of the employer, it's around a duty of care. And I think the notion of a duty of care might need to change. I mean, one area which is slightly one remove, and I can't claim to know much about it, but is a massive area in global contact center and CX, is trust and safety. So the kind of hidden underbelly of the internet, and people being exposed to some really unpleasant things, perhaps not directly from a customer, but we've got an awful lot of people who are exposed to things which can't yet be automated out of existence, and perhaps necessarily, certainly regrettable and really unpleasant, and put a massive strain on those members of staff who aren't going to be paid a great deal of money. And I think there's also a duty of care there. What as an employer do you need to do for your staff?
Yeah. And the reality too is, as people get more obnoxious, as people get to the point where you have people working in animal hospitals that don't want to stay there and do these roles, I think, you can transpose this across, say, all sorts of different industries, or into the contact center space, the spiritual home of you and I when it comes to customer experience management. My concern will be that nobody in their right mind is going to want to be on a telephone over the course of the day and be screamed at constantly by whoever is calling because they've had some type of an issue. And my worry is, unless businesses really pick the baton up and run with it in the direction they need to go, agent attrition, which we know is at very, very high levels already, is just going to get worse.
Yes, yeah. And it's funny, I was talking to somebody earlier on about, you've almost got two waves here. So one is the way in which people are treated, and there's a growing number of consumers. And if I had some research actually came across. So it was Shep Hyken had done some research which said that US research, so 32% of customers admit to shouting and 24% to swearing or yelling and cussing, as you say in the States. And as he said, and the rest have lied. So people feel they're able to behave in a less socially acceptable fashion because they're not face to face, which is probably analogous to how people behave on social media.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But also, in the other side of the equation is through automation, and which is either through AI or not, we're all aware that the type of queries that a customer service agent will deal with are getting more complicated and or more emotionally charged. So for years, people in the CX thought leaders have talked about the rise of the super agent. We'll have the super agent. And I think we've inadvertently got super agents because their role is technically and emotionally more demanding, but they're not being paid any more for it.
Yeah.
And I was in a small contact center a few months ago, and in the UK, the minimum wage had gone up, by 50p an hour, which meant that the minimum wage caught up with the salary paid to those agents. And one of them said in a slightly offhand way, minimum wage, minimum effort. And I think that's probably what you get. You either emotionally disengage from your activity because it's too draining, it's too demanding, or you're right, you remain emotionally engaged, but can only cope with so much. And attrition isn't going away. You're right.
You just brought something up that I think is really important, and I just want to explore this for a bit. And that is the rise of social media over the course of the past, well, nearly 20 years now, and how people behave in social networks. It used to be that there'd be two very different personalities. There would be your online personality on social media, and then there would be your in-person personality. But I find that there's been a significant convergence of the two the past few years, and I don't see this as necessarily a good thing. People seem to treat incidents like this as almost entertainment. And they're just not. If you're in a restaurant and somebody is abusing a waiter or a waitress or somebody at the cash till, the instinct now isn't to try and help out or to implicate yourself and get involved. Now it's you pull your phone out and you videotape it. I mean, it's ridiculous what's going on. And have we become such a voyeuristic society, Steve, where customer rage is now actually part of our daily lives and daily equation and something that we get kicks from?
I think for some people, I think it is. And, neither of us are qualified to go down this route, but is maybe some of it to do with a sense of disempowerment, that people feel politically, financially disempowered. So you seize your opportunity to have leverage where it presents itself, and maybe it presents itself, yeah, when you're buying groceries or when you're speaking to somebody in a contact center. And I know anecdotally, I'm talking a couple of decades ago, working in contact centers where, whether this was true or not, there was a perception that as an agent, you would tolerate so much. And that was often around swearing, cussing, Shep Hyken would say. And if somebody swore at an agent, they'd often say, I won't be able to continue this call if you continue to speak to me in this manner. And that seemed to be a default. It wasn't a written standard, but most call centers seem to work to that level. And I don't think they can anymore, because I think people's mode of behavior has altered to such an extent. But then I think that, to your earlier point, that's incumbent on management to support their staff. And sometimes there is something quite liberating, and not every organization can do this, to say, I don't want you as a customer. You are not, the customer is not always right. They're not always king. And sometimes it's morally beneficial for my team to no longer have you as a customer.
Yeah.
I think that needs to happen more.
Let's talk a little bit about an issue you brought up with me when we were planning out the pod, Steve. And this was something I had not thought of, but the extent to which cultural disconnects can lead to anger when you've got an agent on one end of the line and a consumer on the other. You had some thoughts on this. Can you talk a little bit about how this dynamic might play out and might impact this customer anger topic that we're going through today?
Yeah. So I think it's obviously easier to be either brave or unpleasant at a distance. So I might be more willing to shout across the road some abuse at you than I would be if I was 2 feet away from you. And I think the either communicating digitally or by voice creates a barrier, creates a distance. But then a perception that somebody is not like you or somewhere else shouldn't mean you behave worse, but I think it does. And that can cut both ways, of course. So if I'm not culturally aligned with you, I may also be somewhat less empathetic towards you and, afford you fewer allowances. And I don't know what impact things like accent neutralization software will have. Now, if I'm a consumer and it works right, I presumably won't be conscious that there's some accent neutralization taking place. But if it's not my voice that is having the conversation with you, I, as an agent, will probably, I would imagine, feel more disengaged from that conversation and less bought into that brief relationship that I'm building with you. And I don't think we really know what these impacts will be, but I think every layer every bit of distance creates dissonance and makes it easier probably for people to behave worse, to be further away from the best version of themselves. And the other thing around culture, which I thought was quite interesting, this was somebody called Masako Take, who I've never met, but she's a Japanese CX expert. And she was saying that similar things happen in Japan, but because of Japanese culture, it doesn't tend to be what you might get in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is shouting and rage. It's more of a cold anger, which again acts as an impediment to a good dialogue and a good resolution. So, even in a very sort of controlled and mannered society like Japan, people are becoming less tolerant. It's really interesting.
I think a little bit about my mom used to have an adage, you get more flies with honey than you do with the vinegar. And I have to think from a consumer standpoint, that's something that we need to think about when we want somebody who's a customer service rep to be able to do something on our behalf. As you say, Steve, we're not entitled. The customer is not always right. And there's certain instances where flexibility on the part of the representative, whether it's in a call center or maybe it's a server or a store clerk, etc., or somebody working at reception in a hotel, you need a little bit of flexibility from their side. They're not going to do it if you're shouting and screaming at them and swearing. I mean, that's just not cool.
No, absolutely. And I think that's again why it comes down to a little bit to how employers support their staff. So, for instance, if you and well, in fact, you were in a pub in London, weren't you, a few weeks ago? I didn't make that.
I will neither deny nor confirm those claims.
But if you were to go to the bar and ask for a drink, and if you were rude and unpleasant and ungrateful, and it was a fairly busy bar, I can be fairly confident you'd wait a much longer time for your second drink than you did for your first. But in a more controlled and mechanized type environment, like a fast food outlet, that probably wouldn't be the case because you'd have your place in a queue, which is the beauty of the British system of not queuing in pubs. That's a different podcast worthy there, where people have started queuing in pubs, which is culturally inappropriate.
But you do queue in the UK really nicely at bus stops, which is what I always appreciated. You always had an orderly entry to the bus in London, which I thought was fantastic. Trust me, it's not the same where I live.
Is it not? Oh yeah,
no.
we're good. We are good queuers, but never in a pub. Never in a
pub. Okay, listen. Here's another topic that you brought up that I think is well worth discussing. And quite frankly, this is something that's really boiled my blood and raised my blood pressure in the past. And that is the extent to which automation or AI-driven automation, I don't like the term AI agents because agents aren't AI. It's an automated interface that AI can power, but we understand that's semantics. But the reality is there's a lot of automation out there that's just not ready for prime time. And I can't help but think for a lot of consumers, especially, thinking about things like where you just can't get a hold of a person, there's no telephone number available, or if you do have a phone number, they will not let you speak to somebody. And I'm thinking specifically as an example, food ordering apps here in Canada are notorious for that. This has got to be an issue in terms of what's making consumers angry and willing to vent their rage.
Yeah.
If they can get a hold of somebody.
Yeah. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there will be scenarios when you feel you have to talk to somebody. Now, usually that's because you could be angry and you want to vent, but as often you're just confused. You're confused and you're confounded. And most contemporary consumers who've got a problem will try and resolve it themselves. And I think where rage and frustration kicks in is where you're absolutely right. You're not presented with a couple of the best options to resolve your problem. You're instead presented with barriers and blockers and call avoidance. I hate the term call avoidance. I mean, call avoidance as in trying to avoid people making calls by getting to the root cause of what's caused them in the first place. I'm all for that kind of call avoidance, but I'm not in favour of blocking you having a means as a customer to interact with the brand. And I think there's a degree of wrong-headedness there. That an automation should primarily be about focus on the challenges or problems that affect our customers. First, let's try and remove them upstream so they don't present themselves. Secondly, if it's something the customer needs to do, allow them to do it in the easiest possible way, which is almost certainly not ringing up the contact center. 9 times out of 10, digital is quicker than analog, but only if you present it to people at the right time. And don't, for instance, hide your phone number, put them into a massive queue, and then 8 minutes into the queue, give them a helpful in-queue message saying, did you know if you went online, because nearly everybody would have gone online. And I think that's when the organization starts to stoke the rage, drive the frustration, and it's the agent who suffers.
So then a logical question that I think a forward-looking business person should be asking themselves is, how much is this costing businesses in lost clients and lost revenue over the long term? Because I was always taught, going back to my MBA days, and granted this was like 3 decades ago, that it costs 6 times more to win a new customer than it did to retain a current one. I don't know if those numbers have changed, if the ratios have shifted. But Steve, like the reality is consumers do have a lot of choices, whether it's hotels, whether it's airlines, whether it's food ordering apps, whether it's banks. And it's easier to switch now, even if you're subscribed to something, than ever before. So it just strikes me that organizations that are almost purposely putting systems in place that are substandard and driving customer rage are going to suffer the consequences long term.
Yeah, and I think that is almost certainly the case, and I agree with you. I mean that 6-to-1 cost ratio, we've all heard variations around that, and I think the other thing that's a corollary of that is how many people will you talk about when you've had a positive experience, which is potentially one of the flaws about the NPS methodology, because I don't tell people about how great my car insurance provider is. I can't remember what it is, but it's buried on my phone somewhere. But will you tell people about a negative experience? Well, yes, you will tell more people. And now, of course, with the rise of these things and social media, you can potentially tell hundreds and thousands of people about your negative experience. And we all get to be the teller of our own tales. So generally, I won't bother mentioning that I was rude to the customer service advisor. I'll just explain about the illogical, unhelpful, barrier-based response I got from the brand, which is, yeah, absolutely really damaging. But it's all about ease. For all there are societal problems about how we behave towards each other, most people don't really want to have a row with somebody at the contact center. They want their problem to disappear.
Yeah.
And if you can't get rid of the problem upstream, try and make it easy to resolve at the moment at which it arises. And then, yeah, just protect your people. So
as we finish off our chat today, I want to ask you an opinion. Where is this trend going? As we're recording right now, it's early February. Does customer rage get better as a phenomenon? Does it improve? Do people start getting less angry? Or do you think this is something that is going to accelerate as we go through the year and into 2027?
I would, in a sense, I think if more people spoke about it, I'd be pleased by that, because it almost feels like there's an emotional cost to doing business. And the emotional cost of doing business for the organization is that the frontline people, as usual, bear the brunt of things. And so sometimes, simply by acknowledging a problem, it appears to be getting worse when actually we're just recognizing where it lies. I'd love if somebody could do some more research. So I did do a little bit of intense Google research and came up with an academic paper that said there isn't much research into this area, although it did refer to CCSS, contact center stress syndrome. What I think might change this year, and I think it's too early to tell, is the potential rise of a personal AI assistant. And we've all seen examples of this, and they're starting to happen in reality, I believe, talking to either a real or virtual agent on behalf of the brands. Now, as AI tools get to know us better, if I'm irascible, bad-tempered and demanding, then any useful AI assistant will probably become as bad-tempered, irascible, and demanding as I am. And that's quite a hellish prospect, I think, of even if it's rude bot to rude bot, but much worse if it's rude bot to human agent. That's quite dystopian. So I'm really hoping we don't get that.
Well, Steve Sullivan from Channel Doctors, thank you so much. I'm so glad we could make this work and finally get this interview done, because this is a topic I find just fascinating, and I'm certain our listeners around the world will too. And quite frankly, I think everybody can probably relate to. As you say, I think this is a topic that deserves more discussion, and I wish more people, especially on the front lines, would come out and talk a little bit about what has happened to them, some of their experiences, because the more awareness we can drive, maybe the more we can ask or we can get people to behave in a more civilized manner when they're phoning a contact center or interacting with individuals one-on-one live.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.
Peter, I can't hear you.
Sorry, we'll edit that part out.
Okay.
I hit mute.